result of the COVID-19 pandemic and in accordance with the Governor's Emergency Order number 12 pursuant to Executive Order 2020-04 and its extensions, this public body is authorized to meet electronically. Please note that there are no physical locations to observe and listen contemporaneously to this meeting, which was authorized pursuant to the Governor's Emergency Order. In accordance with the emergency order, I'm confirming that we are providing public access to the meeting by telephone with additional access possible by video and other electronic means. We're utilizing Zoom for this electronic platform. All members of the committee and selected legislative staff have the ability to communicate contemporaneously in this meeting through this platform, and the public has access to contemporaneously watch and or listen to the meeting on Zoom or YouTube and via phone by following directions and links that were provided in the General Court website. We've provided public notice of the necessary information for accessing the meeting in the Senate calendar. We're providing a mechanism for the public to alert the public body during the meeting if there are problems with access. And if anyone has a problem, please email, here's an email address, remotesenate@ledge.state.nh.us or call 603-271-3043. In the event the public is unable to access the meeting, will be adjourned and rescheduled. Please note that any votes that are taken during this meeting will be done so by roll call vote. And finally, let's start the meeting by taking a roll call attendance. When each member finally states their presence, please also state where they are and if anyone else is in the room with you during this meeting, which is required under the Right to Know law. I'm Jay Kahn, and I'm in Keene in a room in my house with nobody else present. Representative Wolf.
Hi, Representative Dan Wolf, representing Merrimack District 5. I'm in my office in New London, and there's nobody else in the room.
Representative Ellison.
I'm Representative Art Ellison, represent Merrimack District 27. I'm home by myself in Concord.
Ashley Harble.
I'm Ashley Harble. I am home in my office in Goffstown, New Hampshire. My husband is working downstairs, but I'm alone in my office.
Thank you. Superintendent Balke.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Brian Balke, Superintendent of Schools in Goffstown and New Boston, and I am in my office alone.
Thank you, Superintendent. Dr. Jim Waller. And Dr. Waller did write me and inform me that he would not be present today. Marna Ducharme. Hi, Marna.
Ducharme, and I am in my home in Manchester, New Hampshire, and I am alone in my office, but my husband is working downstairs out of earshot.
Bishop Peter Labashi.
I am Bishop Peter Labashi, the Roman Catholic Bishop of Manchester, and I'm in my residence here in my home. There is no one else in the house.
Thank you, Bishop. Tom White.
Tom White in Keene, New Hampshire, in the Cohen Center, my office here, and I am alone.
Dina.
I'm Dina Chadowitz. I'm in my dining room in Windham, New Hampshire. No one else is in the room. My son is in the house somewhere.
Thank you, Dina. Reverend Harmon.
I'm Reverend Zachary Harmon, and I am present in my apartment in Manchester, and I am alone.
Kati Preston. Okay. Robert Trustin.
Good afternoon. I'm Robert Trustin, and I'm in my home in Dover, Massachusetts, and I'm in a home office. There's nobody else present, but there are other people. My son, my daughter, and my wife are in the house.
Thank you, Robert. And Yves Gakunde.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Yves Gakunde. I'm at the city hall in Keene, and I'm in my office alone.
And Yves, just for when you were further participating, did anyone else have a little volume problem with when Eve spoke?
Oh, you couldn't hear me? Can you hear me now?
That's good. Much
Okay.
better. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Eve Gakunde. I'm at the City Hall in Keene and my office, and I'm alone.
Thank you. And we have a guest from the New Hampshire Department of Education with us today, Nate.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Nate Green with the New Hampshire Department of Education.
Welcome, Nate.
Home alone.
Thank you. And for our first item of business, I should have recognized in the agenda that we have excellent minutes that were provided by Dina Chadowitz. I hope folks had a chance to look them over. And if someone would wish to make a motion for approval, that would be appropriate.
I'll make that motion. Art Ellison.
Thank you, Art. Second,
Seconded.
thank you. That was Ashley, thank you. So any comments on the minutes? I would merely comment at this moment that the last item there said that we tentatively schedule a meeting for December 16th at 3:30. So folks consider that as we're going through the agenda today, and we'll come back to that at the end to see if that still holds good for us. If there are no further comments on the minutes, I'd ask for a roll call vote. I'll just read across, actually, I'll read across the screen, Dina, you probably are recording this, but I'll vote in favor. Dina?
Yes.
Bishop?
Aye.
Tom?
Yes.
Art?
Yes.
Superintendent Balke?
Yes.
Representative Wolf?
Yes.
Marta?
Yes.
Ashley?
Yes.
Reverend Harmon?
Yes.
Robert?
Yes.
And Eves?
Yes.
Okay, we have a unanimous vote of those present. Thank you. So we have before us a couple of items that were shared in advance of the meeting that came from Dr. Green. And I want to thank Dr. Green for his participation today and for sharing these with us. We're going to turn the agenda then to first topic, which is rulemaking process of the State Board of Education. And I'd recognize Dr. Green to lead us through a couple of documents that you've provided, or start us at any point in the process. Well, I'm hoping that we've got 40 minutes for this. It should take us to about 4:20. And hopefully we've got at least 20 minutes for a conversation after the presentation. This is meaty stuff, so it's here for our reference, not just for this meeting and in the future. Dr. Green?
Excellent. Thank you, Senator Khan. I'm very happy to be here. Happy to take any and all questions that we have around this. I'm going to go through what the minimum standards are that the Department of Education uses. The minimum standards themselves are essentially the administrative rules that govern public schools in the state and determine how public schools are delivering an adequate education. So when we tie this back to the statutes, any of the New Hampshire RSAs and statutes that refer to an adequate public education, most of those rules and requirements are found within the minimum standards. The word standard too, I want to make sure that we've got a good understanding of a definition of what that is. So I want to start there a little bit because in education, there's a hierarchy as we move from, the federal and the state governments down to what actually happens within a classroom with teachers and with students. And just as a real quick background, I myself was a high school teacher for about 11 years before I came on with the Department of Education. So I've seen this from both ends there. Essentially, the minimum standards that we have with the Department of Education, that's what's in the 2 documents that I had sent out that you have there. Those are, we call those minimum standards, but that's different from academic standards. And I can go into a little bit more detail there. I'm wondering if I have an ability to share my screen, if that's possible.
Alan?
Yes, you should have the ability to do it there. Does it show on your screen?
It does, yeah, perfect.
Go for it.
Okay, so you should be seeing a Word document here that I pulled up. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. All right, so this is the full minimum standards. And when we talk about going out and monitoring schools and measuring whether or not public school in New Hampshire is delivering adequate education to its students, these are the set of standards that we follow. And what you'll see is that academic content appears in several different places. So the first place that I want to point out is fairly early on within the document. I'm going to scroll down a few pages here to ED 306.04, which is policy development. Now, this sets out a list of all of the policies that a local school board is required to adopt and implement. And this is where you're going to see all the requirements for having a policy on attendance, on school safety, discipline, records retention. And then every now and then you're going to see things that start to veer a little bit towards things like content, particularly within the realm of social studies. So things such as character and citizenship. School boards are required to have a policy on that. And then if we come a little bit further down, number 25, item 25 here are the graduation competencies that every high school in New Hampshire is supposed to have a set of competencies within. And this is essentially the list of required course topic areas that every high school in New Hampshire has to have. So you're going to see that we have policies related to arts education, digital literacy, English, math. And then up here, rather than, you'll see there isn't the word social studies here, it breaks it out into several different content areas. So local school boards are required to have policies on competencies as they relate to US and New Hampshire history, to US and New Hampshire government and civics, economics, world global studies, geography. This is specific to policies. So this is one area within the minimum standards that relates just to the fact that a school board needs to adopt a policy. What I want to point out here is that, consistent with New Hampshire's emphasis on local control, there's nothing here that says what that policy has to be. This is simply saying that here is a list of courses that are required to have graduation competencies, and the local school board needs to develop a policy for that. You'll see in other states that are on the other end of the spectrum from New Hampshire and sort of an opposite local control point of view, more of a top-down, you might see policies that are dictated down by the Department of Education. We tend not to do that. We tend to put more of the onus on the local school board to come up with this specific language. So rather than,
Nate,
yes.
I just want to, you're stopping at a couple of places along the way here, which I did review in advance, and you're hitting the ones that I observed. Are you stopping at these because in the end, if we're recommending rules to the state board, these are sections that we need to determine, are there language modifications that we wish to propose?
I think there are probably two different directions that you could go, or at least in my mind, there are two different directions. You might come up with multiple directions beyond that. One of those is to take the current minimum standards and see where language already exists that's similar to the topics that this committee is discussing, and to add language in to those places. So for example, in these particular topic areas, when it talks about world history, global studies, geography, or US and New Hampshire history, adding language into those areas that are already existing that will meet the needs of this committee. That's one direction. Another direction would be to come down to the bottom of this list after health education and physical education and put a brand new topic in there. That essentially kind of carves out a new topic area and puts it in its own distinct area away from those other more social studies themed topic areas. That requires a little bit more work. It's probably a little bit more language is going to be needed because to be its own content topic area within the minimum standards means that it's representing a pretty significant set of subjects. Now, I'm not advocating for one or the other. I see those as probably the two directions that make the most sense.
Thank you. And while we didn't interrupt there, those were the competencies for high schools.
Yes.
And there's a separate section that is competencies for elementary, K through 8.
Yeah. So this is the second document that I had shared out. And this is just a part of the minimum standards. So it's in that first document, the much, much larger one. But what I wanted to do was pull out the social studies piece, so it's a little bit easier to find and read. So you're not scrolling all the way through the document. And this is, to your point, Senator, this is where it lays out the different developmental levels. So the first piece here is what's appropriate for an elementary school education. And you'll see here under A, the local school board shall require a social studies program in each elementary school grade, excluding kindergarten, opportunities for students to acquire knowledge and understanding of civics, economics, geography, and history in a program consistent with RSA 193C3. So again, it's a little bit more specific now, and it's saying that at the elementary school level, schools are required to give students the opportunity to acquire knowledge and understanding in these areas. So the simple sort of way of adding content into the minimum standards would be to say, if you have a topic area that is similar to these, adding it in at the end of this sentence. That is the probably least amount of work, least amount of words to go in and add a topic area in with something that is already pre-existing. If I scroll down a little bit, here we get to B. This is the local school board shall require a social studies program in each middle school to provide, and then it sets out a few things. And if we go a little bit further down, it talks about high school. Specifically in high school, it talks about the credits that a high school student or that a high school is required to offer to students. So you see we have a credit in national and state history, a credit in world history or global studies, a credit in geography, a half credit in US and New Hampshire government and civics, and a half credit in economics. And then there's an additional credit that is interdisciplinary that could be drawn from a variety of different topics. So there are a couple things that I want to point out here. When we talk about the elementary school and the middle school level, it's easy to add content in, and there generally isn't any kind of restriction or requirement of how much time a school is required to spend on that. So at the elementary school level or the middle school level, you'll see that nowhere within the minimum standards has the state told the school you need to spend 30 minutes a day, or you need to spend an hour a day or 2 hours a day. As opposed to at the high school level, we have specifically spelled out a very specific amount of credits that are required to be offered to students. So there's a higher level of specificity at the high school level than there is at the elementary and the middle school level. And that's across the board, whether we're talking about social studies or science or English or health or PE. So I mentioned earlier, there's a difference between the minimum standards, and we use that word standards, and academic standards. Academic standards tend to be what classroom teachers use to design their curriculum and when they're developing their lesson plans and how they deliver information to students. So the minimum standards is a document that lets schools know what are the topics that they're required to teach. But you'll notice that this does not go into a lot of detail here. So for example, we're telling the middle school program, you need to be sure that you're teaching your students civics. But we're not defining civics here. We're not saying, you know, for the next 4 or 5 or 6 pages, this is what a civics curriculum is. The minimum standard is just requiring the school that they must teach civics, or they must teach economics, or they must teach geography. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen here for a second and go to a different one and bring up some academic standards. So this document here is a representation of what academic standards look like. If I go up to the top here, this is the College, Career, and Civic Life C3 Framework for Social Studies State Standards. And this document is 110 pages. So you'll see our minimum standards for social studies is about 2 pages, a page and a half. This is 110 pages specific to social studies. And this is the kind of document, as we go down and take a look at the table of contents, that is going to really outline what should be covered within each of those content areas. So this type of document is going to define what civics is, and in the context of civic and political institutions, participation and deliberation, democratic principles, processes, rules, and laws. So the way that this works is the Department of Education, through the minimum standards, tells a school, you need to teach civics. A school will use an academic standard document like this C3 document here to define how they're going to teach that civics course. And this is a much, much more specific document. In New Hampshire, we do adopt academic standards. So we have academic standards in math, we have academic standards in science and ELA. But again, because of local control, districts are free to use the standards that we've adopted as a state, but they're also free to use a different set of standards if the district has determined that that's an appropriate thing for their school community. For the most part, most of our districts use the academic standards that we've adopted as a state, and that's particularly true for our 3 core content areas of science, math, and English, because those are the 3 content areas that we test at the state. And our state tests are based on those standards. So most districts tend to use those standards because it's going to tie back into the assessments we give. Social studies is a little bit different because we don't have a state social studies test. And so there are several different academic standards that might be used throughout the state, depending on what a district or a local school board has decided to use. But what they all have to do is teach within those specific content areas: civics, geography, US history, world history, global studies, etc. So I'm going to stop there for a second and see if there are any questions as it pertains to standards or the minimum standards.
I'm sure there are. I was hoping, could you show the history part of that, meaning those standards? Just share your screen one more second.
Social studies ones?
Yeah, this guidance. No, not that, the other one.
Standards, you mean?
Yes.
The C3 doc.
Yeah.
Here we go. Yep.
Yeah, okay, you had it stopped just before the history.
Oh, there we go. Yep.
Yeah. So this document has been adopted by the state board?
I believe that it has, although it was a number of years ago. The Department of Education has been engaged over the past year in writing a new set of comprehensive social studies standards. There's a state committee that comprises several community members and stakeholders and teachers. And I think that work is about 90% done. When that is finished, our expectation is the state board will adopt that set of standards. It's entirely possible that districts will continue to use this set of standards that I have on the screen here, even after the state board adopts the new set of standards. And again, that's really up to the local school board to determine the specific standards that they're going to use for their students. The only requirement is that a school has to have academic standards, and they need to be rigorous and they need to be high quality.
Nate, this is Art Ellison. Just a question about the process that the department's going through now with the social studies standards. Are those available in draft form? What's the process, or what's the situation with that?
That's a good question. So that effort has been led by Ashley Frame. And I know that there have been a couple of subcommittees that have been working within each of the content areas. So they've had a group of economics teachers working on the economics piece, world history teachers working on the world history piece. I believe that there is at least one, possibly two drafts that have been shared publicly. But I can send an email to Ashley and try to get whatever the latest draft is to share with the committee.
That would be great. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree with Art. It would give us some guidance. I got some feedback. I assume that this depth that we're seeing here in 5 pages, a few specific topics where I assume there's some competencies within them, that's what would be expected of this commission to go into that level of detail. Nate, I'm asking you that.
I think it really depends on, how deep the committee wants to go. It really is a question of making a recommendation versus a requirement. So if the committee wants to make a specific requirement that is going to be, placed on all school districts across the state, that really has to live within the minimum standards. And it's less about the curriculum and more about requiring school districts to teach very specific topics. So for example, the minimum standards requires that we teach New Hampshire state history, but it doesn't talk about what teachers have to teach under that. Teachers kind of have a little bit more control over the curriculum that they design for that. So if the committee was to go to that level of depth and create sort of a larger standards document, they certainly could do that. But the Department of Education doesn't have the authority to mandate those standards. We can mandate that schools teach a particular topic. We can't necessarily mandate that schools teach the topic in a specific way, if that makes sense.
That's very consistent with the statute that we adopted, I believe, meaning that it does require each school district to have a policy as to how they're going to teach it. It doesn't say that we're going to recommend how that be done. We would bring forward rules from this commission. Dina?
I have 2 questions.
I guess we could go to the full screen, Alan, to see if we're in the conversation now.
So I have 2 questions. I hope I can state them coherently. So my first question is, you use the word adopted, that the Department of Education adopted that C3 document. But since the Department of Education can't require schools to teach a standard any particular way, what do you mean by adopted? What does adopted mean in that context?
So in that context, it's more of a formality. That the state board has looked at that set of standards in that document, and they determined that for the state of New Hampshire, they feel that it's an appropriate send that school districts use those standards. And by and large, most districts do. Most districts tend to use the standards that have been adopted by the state board. There isn't necessarily a statute or anything in place that requires the State Board of Education to adopt standards in the first place. But in order to implement some of our federal requirements, we have to have standards in place for all of our core subject areas. So when the state board adopts standards, it's oftentimes more fulfilling federal requirements as we accept federal money from the US Department of Education, as opposed to fulfilling state statutes.
Okay, thank you. And then my second question, I think might be a little bit more difficult for me to frame. Our mandate, or the statute's mandate, is for schools to teach Holocaust and genocide education. In order for, and then there's another part that says teach this education in order for students to understand their responsibilities as part of a democracy. So there's this history piece, and then there's kind of this civic responsibility piece. And when you were showing us the actual standards, I was not the C3 document, the earlier document, I was wondering how this topic that we're working on fits within multiple standards. So do you have, given that, do you have any thoughts as to what would be the best way to approach working in the statute's requirements into the standards, given that it overlaps? And particularly, I have that question also, particularly as it pertains to credits, because if you need a credit in US history or global history and a credit in civics, how does this topic, which kind of overlaps those two other topics, how would it operate? Any thoughts? Well, first of all, I'm sorry if the question's not clear, but.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, so there, again, I think the easiest entry point to something like that would be to take the minimum standards as they are now and to add that piece in at the end of a sentence. So if you say that high schools must offer a half a credit in civics, you could amend the sentence to say a half credit in civics, which shall also include instruction in genocide and Holocaust studies. And so you're putting that in to to essentially say that in that half credit course, this is a part of the topic that we want to see embedded within that. Or to, again, put that in at the end of a sentence that talks about world history or global studies. The other thing, and this is separate from social studies, but I can bring my screen up again here for just a second, because I think this may help.
Ashley, I saw your hand up. Anybody else next? Good.
Close the document. So I'm just going to pull it back up again here real quick. So we did something similar about, I want to say 2 years ago. There was some legislation that was passed as it relates to computer science. And so we need to go into the minimum standards and add in information that was relevant and required schools to teach computer science. And there was a number of ways that we could have done that. We could have added it in as part of the technology and engineering education programs that already existed. But instead, what we did was we included it as its own new topic area. I'm going to see if I can. So ED 306.44. And can you all see my screen here?
Yes.
Okay. So this is an example of where, based on legislation 2 years ago, we added in a brand new topic area to the minimum standards. And so you'll see here the first part says that each district shall establish and provide a comprehensive, sequentially designed computer science curriculum implemented on or before July 1st, 2020. It will meet the minimum standards for college and career readiness. So this first piece established the requirement for all schools to develop a computer science curriculum. But we didn't just stop there. We didn't want to just say all schools need to teach computer science, now go figure it out. But we spelled it out a little bit more with some specific topics that we wanted to see taught as a part of computer science. So under B here, the local school board shall require that a computer science education program for grades 1 through 8, so this is looking at our 1 through 8 elementary middle program, provide the following: concepts of computational thinking, the impacts of computing, using collaborative tools and processes to effectively work together to create complex artifacts, recognizing and defining computational problems, developing and using abstractions to manage complexity. So these are all specific concepts that we put into the minimum standards that we felt like were very important to a computer science curriculum. There's a national set of academic standards for computer science that, again, is a much larger document. It's probably about 200 pages. And we took some of the content from those standards. And so you'll see here as we go through, there are very specific topic and content areas that are spelled out within the minimum standards.
So what section was this? 306 what?
This is
44.44. Yeah.
Okay. Yep. So this I would bring up as a really excellent example of taking a content or a topic area and carving out its own section in the minimum standards. So now we're not talking about putting it in as part of a social studies program or putting it in as part of a civics program. We're saying, here it is, it's its own standalone topic area. Now, as part of that, when we go down to the high school piece, we put in a requirement that under C, pursuant to ED 306.27, the local school board shall require that a computer science education program be provided in each high school that offers 2 credits in coursework in one or more of the following core content areas. You'll see computing systems, networks and the internet, data and analysis, and algorithms and programming. These are sort of the 4 core content areas within computer science. So the minimum standards set out the content areas and then required school districts to have at least 2 courses in one of those areas be offered to high school students. Now, there's a really important distinction here. There's a difference between a high school offering a course and a high school requiring that a student take a course. Students are not required to take computer science. So even though the minimum standards require high schools to offer these courses, students are not required to take these courses. The only courses that students are required to take are the graduation courses that are spelled out both in statute and in the administrative rules.
Nate, are you familiar with the amendment that we adopted, the state adopted?
Which one?
On Holocaust and genocide studies, I'm sorry.
I am, yes. Yep.
So there's no credit requirement and there is but there it's within so should we treat it much like the computer science, because there's 2 courses required and that's not what the statute actually said. Just don't want to hear that we've exceeded the statute is, I guess, my point.
Sure, I can understand that. So I think, again, there's probably 2 pathways you could go here. If you felt like this was a large enough content area that you wanted high schools to be able to offer it as a standalone course, then that would be where you would have a requirement in there that high schools offer it. Again, it's just a requirement that they offer it. There's no requirement that students have to take it. If instead the committee was interested in ensuring all students received an education in this at the high school level, you could put it into one of the required social studies courses that already exist right now, or it would be to require it to be its own graduation credit, which, as you mentioned, Senator, I think probably would go beyond the statute to make it a graduation credit.
Right. Ashley, I bet you've got something on this.
So I have a couple questions because that just brought up some new ones. So looking at the computer science, right, we had the grades 1 through 8 band, and it just said somewhere in their curriculum, they have to address these things in computer science, right? It's not like a standalone content area necessarily, but it could, does that mean that it could be embedded within content areas for the computer science one?
So the way we wrote
that correctly?
Yeah, and I'd have to go in and find the specific language. There is a sentence. So, and I'm comfortable talking about the computer science ones because I wrote those ones. Disclosure, I'm a science teacher. I'm not a social studies teacher. So we wrote it to require that grades 1 through 8 had to have a sequential, developmentally appropriate curriculum. And the sequential piece meant that there needed to be computer science topics in each grade level, but it was up to each individual school to either have a standalone course or to embed it in courses that already existed. And so you had to do one or the other, but each local school was able to choose for that 1 through 8 grade band to either embed it or to offer it as a standalone. Many schools do a mixture. They'll embed it through 1st through 6th grade, and then oftentimes we'll maybe offer a standalone computer course in 7th or 8th grade.
Is it possible to write something like that, but instead of doing the grade band 1 through 8, do the grade band, I think does our statute start with 6th grade or is it 7th grade?
It's agnostic.
Okay, so.
Not later than 8th grade.
So that means it can start before 8th grade because not later means before.
Right.
So like, would it be possible to write something that spans middle school and high school and say kind of in that same vein that schools are required somewhere within their curriculum to embed Holocaust and genocide studies, but that gives the freedom of those districts to kind of pick and choose? Because kind of to Dina's point, that I don't think putting it under specific courses in the social studies like standards is the best way to go, because then you're requiring it be like taught within the civics course versus like leaving it a little bit more open-ended, and we can come up with kind of those bullet points like the computer science does. Can we do that with middle school and high school combined together, or is high school totally like a separate thing and it has to be a course requirement?
It does not necessarily have to be a course requirement. When you write the minimum standards, you would still want to separate out the middle school levels and the high school levels. And that's because the minimum standards as a larger document are used as part of our public school approval process. And so a high school is going to be approved based on their standards, separate from a middle school being approved based on their standards. So
we could do two separate
write it
ones,
very
like-
similarly. Yes,
Okay.
absolutely. Yeah,
Because
absolutely.
what I like, and this is just me like thinking, guys, because my brain is like spiraling of like how this could potentially happen. I'm thinking about just like my curriculums. And so I'm actually not a social studies teacher, I'm an English teacher. And I know our statute talks specifically about the social studies aspects of it, but if we were, and last time I brought up the possibility of like, we teach it in English classes, not in social studies classes. We teach Holocaust and genocide studies as an English elective and in English classes. If we wrote something that was like that, more like the computer science for 6 through 8 and then a high school one, does that then leave it open that it can be taught in other subject areas potentially, like if that was something the commission decided? So it's not just pigeonholed as it has to necessarily be taught in a social studies class, but it could also be taught with those same like core pieces in an English class as well. I don't know if that question just made sense.
It does. I think it makes a lot of sense. I think it's also a very good direction to go, because what you're talking about is providing increased flexibility for school districts to implement it in a way that's going to work for their teachers, for their curriculum. Many of our schools will come up with interdisciplinary courses that combine both English and social studies, oftentimes for a double credit. And so sometimes if we try to get too specific with the minimum standards, we put ourselves into a corner, we put ourselves into a box that doesn't necessarily work with oftentimes how innovative or creative individual schools might be with their own curriculum. So what you're proposing has a certain degree of flexibility that also will probably engender more buy-in from the schools themselves.
Thank you.
I think those were my big questions.
I'm sorry?
Oh, I just said, I think those were my 2 big questions.
Great. Marna?
I just wanted to respond to some of what Ashley said, and just overall, I think that her ideas are really good. And going back to the computer science standards, when those were introduced, and I'm in middle school, I'm a social studies teacher in middle school, but those standards were actually presented to all of us in all of our departments. And we had to go through our lessons and kind of put little check marks and write down how we, even though we offer 6th, 7th, and 8th grade computer classes, we also had to indicate how we might be also addressing those standards to make sure that we're hitting them several different ways at several different times, specifically as a computer class, but also as kind of life skills and just how these students might be using computers and those skills and understand how to apply that. And so I think that mentality is something that we can apply here as well. Having whatever we come up with for our standards for this bill, presenting them to our schools a little bit more openly. And it doesn't, even though they're computer standards or they're social studies standards, Ashley's right that the Holocaust is quite often taught within English classes and often in conjunction, either in a humanities type course or two teachers coming together. That's what my husband does in his school. He's a social studies teacher working with an English teacher, and they co-teach lots of or all their topics. So I think that the wider net we cast, the better. And the other thing to know that, and our district does this, and I know others do, probably Ashley's as well, we do something called vertical and horizontal alignment. So horizontal alignment is within a grade level. So we look across the grade level at all the people who are required to teach a certain topic, curriculum, standards, whatever we're doing, and we make sure that there's a certain amount of alignment. It doesn't mean that we have to be in lockstep. It doesn't mean that we have to be using exactly the same sources, but the overarching topics that are being covered are common throughout. But then we also do vertical alignment where we get together our school with our high school, so 6 to 12, and we align vertically and we say, okay, these are the topics. It's introduced in 6th grade, but when does it come up again? Does it come up again at all in 7th and 8th? And then does it come up again and where and when in the high school? So that's the vertical alignment. And so I think once we figure out where we want to put it, and I do think that we should not make it its own little box. I think it should be an addendum to a lot of different pieces within the minimum standards. Then it can be hit in a lot of different ways, and a lot of different levels and departments are then accountable to it. I said a lot. Okay.
That makes a lot of sense. One of the things that we have to always be very careful about is determining what level of resources is a school district going to have to bring to bear in order to fulfill the minimum standard that we're writing. And so are we writing a minimum standard that's going to require every school district to hire a brand new teacher that they've never hired before? Or is it something that they can incorporate into their existing curriculums? And sometimes we do that. Sometimes we add a new standard in that requires hiring a new staff member because it's such a radical shift in what we're doing educationally. But that's something that comes at a very high cost as well. And so I think that's always something that we have to bear in mind when we're looking at the minimum standards is what's the, in addition to what's the impact on the student's education, what's the fiscal impact going to be on the school district and local community in order to meet that minimum standard?
It's a good point. That's actually a joint administrative rules requirement that it doesn't carry unnecessary cost burdens.
I've written
and I think it is the latter that this commission envisioned, not new hiring, that each school district would adopt this within the resources that they've got. And I think the vertical alignment is a good terminology. So I saw Eve and I see Brian. So Eve, you want to go?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks for sharing the information, Ned. Quick couple questions. How often do those documents get updated or revised? And then my second question is, if we would add a new section in one of those documents, how long does it take to get the document adopted or approved? Are we talking in terms of weeks, months, years? Thank you.
That's a great question. We're trying to get to some schedule so that we can pace ourselves appropriately. Could you give us some insight in answering that question? Thank you.
Sure. I'll tell you, honestly, it depends on how controversial the change is, that timetable. And I can sort of go over the steps in the process. I'm going to share my screen again just real quick. I'll bring this up here. Can you all see this PowerPoint here?
Yes.
Okay. So this is the process for adopting rules, whether those are new rules or whether they are changes or revisions to the rules. The very first step is an initial proposal. And so a draft of the requested changes are brought to the State Board of Education. And the State Board of Education meets once a month, and they take a look at the draft and they discuss it at their meeting. And then at the close of that meeting, that draft goes out for public review and public comment. And so when we come back, oftentimes it's the very next month at the next state board meeting, there's a public hearing. And at the public hearing, that gives an opportunity for anybody within New Hampshire to come to the state board meeting and to give public comment. Oftentimes it's done in person, although people can submit public comment in writing as well. And the state board takes all that public comment and kind of puts all that together. And after the public hearing, there's a final proposal. The final proposal is then, it goes from the State Board of Education to GELCAR. GELCAR is the Joint Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules, and that's a joint committee between the two houses of the legislature. And they have to take a look at the changes in the rules and make sure, one, that the rules don't violate any state law or state statute, and two, that the rules themselves are consistent with other administrative rules that currently exist, and that they're consistent with any legislation that prompted the change in the first place. GELCAR usually gives either an approval, a conditional approval, or an objection, and then that goes back to the state board. GELCAR has specific times that they meet as well. If GELCAR approves the rule and they send it back to the state board, then the next state board meeting, the state board would be able to adopt that rule, and then essentially it goes into effect. And at that point, school districts would have to implement the rule, unless something within the rule had a very specific date that said, districts will implement by, June of 2021 or February of 2022, which we can write dates into rules if we want to try to provide some flexibility for districts in timing. So in an ideal world, you're probably looking at, month 1 for initial proposal, month 2 for public hearing, month 3 for final proposal and going to GELCAR. And then sometimes GELCAR at their very next meeting in the same month can turn it around and the state board adopts it. And so the shortest turnaround you're looking at is probably 3.5 months. If there's significant back and forth between the state board and GELCAR, or if it's very controversial and there's a lot of people that come out of the public hearing, both for and against the rules, sometimes there'll be an additional public hearing and that can extend the time period. So I would say for any changes in rules, you're looking at somewhere between 3 and 6 months from initial proposal to adoption.
And Nate, at what point does this commission continue to advise the Board of Education? I know this is a little bit different because the commission is bringing forward rules as opposed to asking the department to implement something that the legislature has already adopted. But after we prepare the initial proposal, is this essentially a document that the state board has the responsibility or the control to guide further revisions?
That would be my guess. And I only say that because the state board under statute has the authority over those administrative rules in conjunction with GELCAR. And so oftentimes there are very different bodies that might bring initial proposals of rules to the state board. But ultimately, I think once this process starts, the state board is the one that has the statutory authority over the rules because they're the ones that are going to have to implement the rules, or not implement, but monitor and evaluate and ensure that districts are complying with those rules. However, having said that, oftentimes when there's an external body that has brought forward an initial proposal for rules, they're involved at each of these steps. So they would be at each of those state board meetings. They'd be at the public hearing, at the final proposal, so that if the state board has questions, oftentimes the process, even though the state board drives the procedure piece, the content and the questions asked are usually deferred back to the body who's brought the rules forward, which in this case would be the committee. So my guess is the committee would still be involved throughout the process.
Thank you. Brian?
Thank you, Senator. Nate, thanks so much for being here with us today. This has been very educational and helpful for all of us, I'm sure. I also really appreciate you willing to send the draft social studies standards that many of us would like to take a look at and look at how the work of this commission overlaps. You actually beat me right to my question. So I was going to talk about the process of going through and making this commission. We'll be making recommendations for rule changes. We also will have some recommended policy work that we'll be doing. But I was going to just speak to the process of going through the state board, getting that initial process, and then moving on to JALCAR. So you covered it. That's exactly what I was going to talk about, Senator. I've been through this a number of times, and I was right there, and he just got right to it before I could say it. So thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you,
Well
Eve.
done.
Robert and Reverend.
Yeah, I just sort of a procedural question. It's the commission's makes the recommendation based upon some of the options, Nate, that you presented, just in terms of like full course, considering whether it should actually go into an existing, subject discipline that is already there. And then the other question is, after the 3 to 6 months, what's typically the lead time for school districts to then start implementing? And who's responsible for putting together, like I think the local discretion on how you do things is really important, but who takes on like, okay, well, these are the options, this is what's out there, or do school districts just sort of have to do it on their own? Like, how does that work?
It kind of depends from district to district. So really, the Department of Education on the back end, after adoption, well, let me answer your first question first, because you asked about a timeline for adoption by schools. Usually, we try to give a full year prior to requiring a school to adopt something, because they need time to take a look at their curriculum, to look at the teachers who are going to do it, and to determine how they're going to bring the new minimum standard revisions into their current existing curriculum. Does that mean hiring new staff? Does it mean writing new lesson plans? Does it mean adopting new standards for them? So generally 1 year is a pretty safe bet to say, we're going to adopt this now, but it's going to be effective 1 year from now. And that 1 year essentially needs to be used by districts to plan, because when they hit that effective point, it's got to be in the classroom, they've got to be teaching it, they've got to be ready to go. I could see something where, if you adopted something in, say, October, you could say, well, by August, which is the start of the next school year, we'd like to see it happen. Now you're talking a little bit less than a year, but that's probably still enough time for most districts to be able to implement it. What you don't want to do is adopt something in July and say, next month, you got to be teaching this, because the schools are going to tell you, we don't have enough time to do it. We got to be able to plan.
Is that stated in any of the, is it in the proposal?
It would be part of the rules.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It would be part of the rule.
Yep. That you could. And often, if it's not part of the rules, oftentimes we'll put out a non-regulatory guidance document to schools that basically says, we're not going to ding you. Even though there's no date on here, we're not going to check for this for another year.
Thank you. Reverend Harmon.
Yeah, thank you. Well, first, just subsequent to roll call, my wife came home and is in another room, so just announcing that. But two questions, and I'm in kind of the religious field, not the education field, so these might be off kilter kind of questions. But just when we're talking about maximum flexibility and the New Hampshire value for local implementation, I was just wondering if it would make any sense at all to put a requirement like this in some of the earlier policies, I think like 306.06, that has to deal with character and citizenship, because I think when we talked about this at the last committee meeting, one of our key intents, it sounded like, was to kind of equip people so that they'd be aware of these kind of patterns in society and know how to avoid them. And so I just wonder if there'd be any wisdom in putting it there for maximum flexibility, or if that would totally be not make sense. And then also, I think we're also looking at in-service or professional development as something else that we're trying to do to equip teachers. And so I saw something in 306.16 regarding that, and just wondering if there's any wisdom you had to help with that. That's all. Thank you.
So in terms of the policy question, you certainly could put a line in the beginning there that says, local school boards must have a policy on how they adopt this or how they integrate this into their curriculum. My only recommendation would be very, very careful how you word that, because there are some of our policies, the way that the requirements are worded, where a local school district can have a policy and the policy says that they don't do what's in the policy. And they've now fulfilled their statutory obligation by having a policy. So you want to just be careful that, if you're going to require a district to have a policy, the language also kind of spells a little bit out what should be in the policy, if that makes sense. A great example of that is physical fitness. Later on in the minimum standards, all school districts are required to have a policy on whether or not their students are engaged in physical fitness. And it's that whether or not piece that some districts have used to say, well, that our policy says that it's the not the whether. And so we don't have a physical fitness policy, but that's the policy. So sometimes language is important. Oftentimes language is very important. The professional development piece, professional development is not touched on a lot in the minimum standards, because at the end of the day, individual teacher professional development is the responsibility of the local school district, local school board. So we bring in a large amount of Title II federal funds into the department that we act as a fiscal agent for. We turn around, we give those out to school districts, and school districts use those to fund their professional development for their teachers. So we really don't have much in the way of resources at the state level to do any kind of statewide professional development, because all the resources that we bring in, we turn around and we push those out directly to school districts through the Title II program. So we can make recommendations, but we don't necessarily have state level funds to do a large scale statewide professional development program.
Thank you.
Dina, you want the last question? Can't hear.
If I can remember it.
Got it.
Mr. Green, the statute, the Holocaust Genocide statute actually stated that its requirements went into effect, like they went into effect in July, I think even before, or no, they went, in September, I think they were effective. So that's way before we met and way before this year that you're talking about. Do you have any thoughts about that? Any thoughts about how we might get the word out to schools that the statute's required, even though there are no standards yet, or whether we should be doing that, or any wisdom at all, given that the requirements are in effect right now?
I'm certainly not a lawyer, and I would, if it was going to be me and I was going to try to interpret the statute a little bit freely, I would say that the statute going into effect prompts the commission, which is now formed and is doing its work. Schools really aren't able to implement something until they're told how to, and so the commission is going to have to do that work first to create that minimum standards document in order for schools to know what it is they're going to implement. Because on the back end, one of the things that I do specifically in my job is evaluate school districts in how they're implementing the minimum standards. And so if I go out to, and I go out and have a conversation with Brian out in Goffstown and Dumbarton about how they're, implementing the minimum standards, I'm not going to have anything to judge this particular statute against because we haven't written it yet. So I think it's an ongoing process.
I think also we've got section 6 in the bill, which is in page 2 of 5. But anyway, it does make reference back to the enabling language in 193 and say that rulemaking is required by the State Board of Education. So minimally there's conflict in broad interpretation. This states that the statute goes effective with the rulemaking. That'd be my interpretation of what we've got here. both of which were effective on the same date. Anybody else going? All right. Nate, I want to second the comments that we're very grateful for you informing us early on in this process what to expect. And it sounds like a dialogue between us along the way is likely. Just to say, hey, we're leaning in this direction. We see some guidance for elementary schools, for high schools. We could probably present some drafts along the way, and I think your guidance would be valuable if you're amenable to that.
Absolutely. I've shepherded several rules through the process now, so I'm more than happy to help in whatever way that I can.
That's great. And I think the request from Superintendent Balke is helpful. I think seeing what's in draft from the social sciences folks, whether we elect to parallel their structure or borrow some of the competencies and, with modifications, I think that would be really helpful.
Absolutely. I'll shoot a draft of that as soon as I can get my hands on it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you
All right.
so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to sign off and go get my kids. Is that okay?
Yeah. I hope it's timely.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Well, thanks, folks. Transitioning from this topic, it was going to be that we get into the discussion of the policies work that and that subcommittee. So I think, Brian, if you'd like to lead that conversation, and I want to thank Representative Wolf for bringing some information that I think we shared with the entire commission. I also want to give some credit to Bob Trustin, who that document that summarized all the states, that's based on a compilation that the Anti-Defamation League put together that was very useful in reviewing and writing our statute. So Brian, you want to take it away?
Yes, thank you, Senator. So we had the chance to meet. It was Representative Wolf, Representative Ellison, Dina, and myself. And we very quickly came to the realization that the new social studies curriculum frameworks were critically important to see what was in them. So we spent some time reviewing and talking about the last old New Hampshire standards, as well as sort of the importance of these new standards moving forward. I would see the work that we will be doing likely twofold, and I would defer to my colleagues if they have any input on this. The first is, I think we should focus on some of the content of some options for the minimum standards, and whether we want to probably, as a larger commission, have some philosophical discussions about whether we want to consider kind of the minimalist approach, as Nate had recommended, to add language at the end of existing language within the ED 306 minimum standards, or to think about the example of the computer sciences and to have something that's perhaps a little more comprehensive with a little more specificity. I think our group would be happy to take a shot at writing those some of those options in the minimum standards, and likely spearheading the process. I'd be happy to work with Nate and with Commissioner Edelblue to get on to the agenda for the state board and kind of help champion that process all the way to JALCAR. The other pieces that we talked about, and Representative Wolf did some research and spoke with Barrett Christina, who is the executive director of the New Hampshire School Boards Association. We thank him for making that contact. I also work closely with Barrett, so we've got some folks who have some history with the School Boards Association. We're going to need some draft policies, so that will be an additional piece that either our group or another group would take on. So we talked about how that process would transpire, and And largely, that's as far as we got in the subcommittee meeting that we had. I would pause there and see if anyone had anything to add to that, or if I could answer any questions.
No, I think you got it, right?
Brian, I was found myself on that fulcrum that I think this conversation set up by Reverend Harmon and Nate in, does this, and anyway, a lot of comments there, but are we better defining a separate section, like section 47 of these standards, where we can specify something for elementary schools and high schools, the something being competencies that would be appropriate at different grade levels, or how competencies might be satisfied. Anyway, I think that the liberty of having an independent section as opposed to trying to embed this into other sections, I found might fit the commission better. I invite that conversation because I think that that is an important early decision.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
So just kind of thinking about that, I think that the more flexibility, kind of what Myrna and I were saying, the more flexibility and the more open-ended we can leave this for school districts as far as like where it fits in. Like my big concern with adding it to the end of one of those sentences is it pigeonholes it into a specific course. And I think you're going to get a lot more pushback from teachers who are going to go, I don't have time as it is to fit my whole curriculum in, or I agree that like looking at the new social studies standards is important, but like, I don't personally think that it necessarily should be something that's only taught in like a particular social studies course, because I think that that just pigeonholes it and I think we're going to get a lot of pushback from districts as far as like, we don't have time to cover everything that we need to cover already, versus if we do something more like the computer science, it does leave it open to teach it in like multiple different ways and across multiple different content areas. And like Myrna was saying, vertically align as well as horizontally align across grade levels to make sure that, we don't want to just hit this once, right? We want to make sure that we're talking about different pieces of this, because there's like, what I might teach at a middle school level is going to be very different than the depth and the discussions that I have at a high school level surrounding Holocaust and genocide education. And if we're looking at kind of doing both pieces, right, we're not just focused on the Holocaust, we're also focused on these other genocides that are happening and how they're currently still happening around our world. I think having multiple places that staff can put them in and that teachers can embed this into their curriculum with kind of those big guiding questions, or those kind of essential questions, essential competencies, whatever we want to call them, but kind of those guiding discussion pieces is a better way to go. So I very much like more kind of what we saw with like the computer science and making it its own piece to allow for that flexibility and to allow for it to be hit on multiple levels versus, it has to be taught in civics or it has to be taught in global studies. I think that pigeonholes it way too much.
Thanks. I see Marna, Dina, Dan.
Thank you. I'm going to echo what Ashley just said. I seem to do it a lot today, but I really feel like something like this, or really any content, we want to find the organic placement for it, not the forced placement for it, if that makes some sense. And I think that the more places where we can hit it with literature, with historic perspectives, with content, with geography connections, whatever it is that we're trying to accomplish, I think the more open we leave it, the better. I suppose the risk in leaving it open is everybody saying, well, somebody else will get it. And I think that that might be the fear that maybe some of us are looking at. But when we do those vertical alignments, that's what ties us into that. So we can alleviate that fear as long as the districts are doing their jobs. And Mr. Balke, you can, verify that or not, that is a common practice. And I think that once we say we're going to commit to it, we will. We just have to find those organic places where it fits in. I also think that we have to look at science and social studies are content versus math and language arts, which are more skill. And we're looking at content, and content can go anywhere. You can do the skills of reading and writing through the content of genocide education or the content of Tiananmen Square or anything else. So because this is content, it fits anywhere and it can fit at any level. We wouldn't get that specific in the lower elementary grades. I know we're not even addressing, well, I don't know how low we're going to go, but the upper elementary grades can handle this content as long as it's developmentally appropriate, and it can still fit in anywhere. So we really want to look for those appropriate ins within social studies, but also other content areas and skill areas.
Second everything you said, Marna.
Thank you.
Seconding you.
Dina? Yeah.
I was just thinking that maybe it doesn't have to be either or. Maybe we can balance these two interests. One, the need to ensure that some basic facts are taught on the one hand, and that it doesn't get missed because everybody's thinking somebody else is going to do it. And on the other hand, the desire for flexibility that Ashley and Marna are talking about by adding a piece to this is just amusing. I don't really know what the best outcome would be, but what I'm thinking is, could we add a requirement to the social studies US history standard that requires some education in the Holocaust and any genocide in which the US is involved, and then also have either a standalone provision or tack on to the civics requirement the requirement that schools make this connection between genocide and Holocaust and choices that people make. So that we're considering a third possibility, not only the computer science or only tacking on, but tacking on and a standalone. I don't know if that's possible.
I think he pointed us to both what graduation competencies are and course requirements. So I don't think we're going to go in the course. If we would follow this conversation, the course requirement wouldn't be, we don't have statutory authorization to go there, but there could be a graduation requirement. But Brian, and then we'll come back. Oh, and I'm sorry, Dan. Yeah.
Thank you, Senator. I think we ought to have a discussion with the administration and maybe some faculty members to see where we're going to get the least amount of pushback. I see that every time you're adding requirements, whether it be embedded in one or a section 47, there's going to be pushback. And I'd like to know or get a sense of how much we're going to receive, if any at all, when we move forward, and which way the teachers and the administrators would see this going. So, just a thought.
It's a good one.
Right.
Yeah, I'll take a shot at that, Representative Wolf. First of all, anything that gets added into the minimum standards that is something new that school districts have to do as a general order, we don't like it. because it takes more time. Now it's one more thing we've got to figure out. It's one more thing we've got to ask someone to do who's already overburdened. Particularly during a year like this, the teachers are already fried, so we need to be really sensitive about what we're adding to the plates of educators. And as someone who often has a lot to say about funding of education in the state, we want to make sure that there are no unfunded mandates in terms of purchasing curriculum materials, some of those kinds of things. So this is one that if and when this came to me, I would say, well, we're going to do this because this is the right thing to do. And so from my perspective, I think Ashley and Marna are on the money with how we should give flexibility for how districts would implement this. Districts like flexibility. So in general, let me, tell me what I have to do, but don't tell me how to do it. Let me figure out how we're going to do it within our system and the resources that we have. And then what I would really like to see is, so in terms of the JALCAR piece, I think we should plan for and I'll call it that computer science type approach where it's a standalone section, it's an additional section. That's probably the best place for us to start, because if we had pushback from the state board or the state board wasn't supportive or there was public comment in opposition to that, we could always scale it back and look at the what I might call that add-on language. But I would start with the more comprehensive approach. And then one of the most important things for me is I would want to look for, and I think we might have just lost, did Tom just leave the call? But I was going to say someone like Tom, or people like the Reverend or the Bishop, people who are experts in this field. I'm not an expert in this field, and I'm sure I have teachers that are very competent and have extensive history and background, but I would look to some of you who would be more content experts that might be able to develop some resource documents that school districts can use to implement the minimum standards and then ultimately their school board policy that they'll have to do. So I see it as, I think we go the JALCAR route with the standalone entity with the ability to scale it back. I think we have to draft some model policy, and then we need to give resources to the field. And I like it within that flexible kind of model that Marna and Ashley had shared.
Sorry, I have to excuse myself. I have another meeting at 5 that I'm chairing.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Senator, I'm also going to be leaving at 5.
Okay.
Another meeting.
Okay, busy people. Thank you, Dan. Ashley, do you want to?
So kind of just going with what Brian was just talking about, as far as like resources are concerned, there is 100% a way to do this completely unfunded. There are so many, at least within the Holocaust piece of it. And I am working part of what I was tasked with by Tom for our professional development team committee worked this past week. And then our best practices are meeting tomorrow. So one thing that I was tasked with as part of that, sorry, my dog's barking, that first committee was to come up with some professional development and resources that we can build. And then kind of, I'm assuming that our best practices committee tomorrow will be working and creating some of those resource guides, Brian, that you would want for your teachers. And there's so much already out there. I pretty much teach my entire Holocaust studies year-long elective 100% free. My district bought like one book, but that's like in addition to all of the other stuff that I have and that's out there. So it's totally possible to do. And I think that between myself and Marna and Tom and Robert at the ADL, and there's so many resources that are out there that are free that we can kind of make these guides for teachers to use. I think that's totally a possible thing to make sure that each district does feel comfortable. And I know I've been working with Dina on providing professional development that's free for districts as well, so that if there's teachers that don't feel comfortable, they have this free professional development. And I'm creating and curating a list of other professional development opportunities too that we as a committee want to look at for staff and for districts.
Great. So we've got 4 people on that subcommittee working with Brian, right? And I guess I'm just wondering, not to, but Marna and Ashley, you have some vision that it sounds like it aligns with where Brian is thinking, and it might be helpful if you joined his conversations. I'm just saying that.
Yeah, I'm happy.
But there might be some efficiency to doing that, and we're still at 6, and we're not a majority there. We asked before some people, or Dan, we lose another person. Dan, is the December 16th, the Wednesday afternoon, a good day for you? And
hang on a moment, Senator.
And then Brian, anything else? Closing thought? Think you can get together sometime between here and there to, if you got the social sciences in front of you, you can maybe launch some framework for us to look at by that date?
Yeah, I would hope so. So we'll plan to get together. I'll connect with Representative Wolf and Representative Ellison and Dina. And if either Marna or Ashley would like to join us or connect at a later point, Ashley, if you live in Goffstown, you could just swing by my office for a cup of coffee sometime.
That works.
But
Ryan, what was the date of our next meeting? Maybe you want to share that now with Marna and Ashley. It's December 3rd, is it?
I don't remember.
Okay.
Brian, you can just email me. I'm literally right up the street from like where the high school is, up in Goffstown.
I think it's December 3rd at
I don't have it.
no, I don't
either.
Can you just email it?
Yeah, just email it. I don't have my school calendar up in front of me anyway, so just email.
It'll come out subsequent to the meeting.
Okay.
Hey, Marna.
I just want.
And thanks.
And Senator, I'm going to call you about maybe a committee change on my own, so I'll give you a call in the next day or so.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. I just wanted to say that the C3 framework that Dr. Green had mentioned is available online. So anybody, you can just Google that and just type in C3 framework for civics and it'll come right up. So if you wanted to start, if anyone was interested, and because it sounded like some people were, I know that we're waiting on the draft for the New Hampshire standards, but the C3 standards are the ones that are being used by most social studies classes throughout the state. And we also tend to use those and the National Geographic ones, especially for geography classes, but there are other standards in there that apply to the other social sciences. So those are readily available on the internet. Just you can Google either one of them and take a look, and maybe if that's what people are interested in, but those are there. So people can take a look at how they're set up, the language, and where there's overlap within the social sciences, which is a big part here.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Tom convened. Tom convened the best practices group.
So we met the implementation committee the best practices committee is meeting
tomorrow.
Okay. Any thoughts on that communication implementation that you'd like to share?
So Tom tasked me with kind of creating a list of professional development opportunities. I'm going and reaching out to a couple other people in other states that are also on kind of commissions similar to this one for statutes that were brought about in their states, as well as reaching out to my contacts at like Yad Vashem and Echoes and Reflections and the ADL to kind of see what kind of professional development opportunities there are. And then a few other people like Reverend Harmon. I don't know if you want to speak with what Tom tasked you to. So
Yeah,
I'll throw it to you, Reverend Harmon.
Thank you, Ashley. Yeah, Dr. Waller and I are going to be meeting to just talk about how to implement and promote this within, as far as genocide and the indigenous community and how to talk about that. And so we're going to be meeting to just kind of start the process on thinking about how, how to go about that in a good way in this. So that's just something else that we're working on too.
Hey, I had a question about the implementation group of you.
Yeah.
So I think there's sort of like two ways you can think of implementation. One would be after the statutes, after we've done our work, and one would be now. Did you have a thought whether there's any implementing to be done right now, as opposed to what was your thought about what the implementing now would be, as opposed to down the road, other than what Reverend Harmon just mentioned?
Well, just to connect back to that conversation about the statute and where I was, I think it's really important to get this right when we, relative to the implementation, and not quick, but something that carries full expectation of local implementation. And I think that's going to take time. I think the process that was outlined, if we should take our time over the next couple of months to look at drafts, and I think compare with what other states perhaps have for rules. And then try to have something complete within for the start of the next school year, so that schools, I would assume, when Brian pulls together his superintendent's report at the beginning of the year, he's got a full audience of teachers that are kind of fresh to say, hey, there are some new rules that we'll need to take on in the course of this new school year. I think if that could be done in August with the blessings of the state going through the state process, that would be wonderful. Might be a little aggressive, but something to shoot for.
I've asked some folks to start assembling some. I hopefully I'll have some stuff for our best practices tomorrow. Our meeting, just looking at, how others are doing this and what works and what doesn't.
I think there are lots of handoffs while we, have separate subcommittees, which I think make it more efficient for the input of and tasking. Obviously, best practices from other states are something that should inform our rules. Brian?
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah.
I would agree. I think your timeline is probably achievable.
That would be great. So it means the next couple months, we, puts us probably at February, trying to get before the State Board of Education, which sounds quick, but it's somewhere in that February, March timeframe. And I think giving ourselves what that time frame is will be very helpful. And I think this conversation about what genocide, Holocaust is so well documented. Genocide is too. It's just real broad. And I think trying to draw some parameters around it, Reverend, I think it's a good thing that you're working at that. Ashley.
We also, just kind of going off of that, part of what we talked about too was trying to pull people from different communities to kind of consult with us as we're building some of those best practices and as we're building some of our implementation strategies, to make sure that their voices are being heard in the process and that we're telling the story as it should be told instead of how kind of we view it. So that was a big conversation that we had. So I know Reverend Harvin is reaching out to some people in his community, and we're going to kind of try to get some people that are going to be able to consult with us and meet with us to talk to us about how they want their story told within schools and what's the important pieces that we need to make sure that schools in New Hampshire are covering to make sure that we're telling the right story.
Yes. Yeah, Reverend.
Oh, I'm sorry. Ashley, do you go ahead, Ms. Harble, or I felt bad.
Mrs. Harble.
Mrs. Harble. Okay, all right. Thank you. That was a really good point on just different communities and how they would like to be involved. What's a way that makes sense and not to re-traumatize in one form. And I think one other thing we're talking about too in the implementation is what are the roles beyond school? Would libraries be involved in promoting this? Because there's this idea of how do we promote beyond schools, and it's in the language there. And so I'm hoping that that's something where Bishop Labashi and I and others can be of service in networking with the community on this. And that'll be another piece to unwrap as we keep going.
Right, and that would be I hope you will tee up that conversation that you brought that up about Genocide Week, and others chimed in on that last time. How do we call attention to genocide broadly that is inclusive of the different communities within New Hampshire?
I'll just point out that December the 9th is the United Nations. It's got a very long title. Ashley and Marta, you may know the title, but it's the United Nations Genocide, Victims of Genocide Awareness Day worldwide is December the 9th. I actually have to leave because I need to get ready for running a meeting at 5:30.
Good. And I just want to check with Marna and Ashley. I think that we tried to do the 3:30 start today. Brian, you too, to make sure that school schedules, we gave enough time for you to get home, get seated, get ready. But I think the drop-off rate is going to be really quick at 5 o'clock. Just anticipating future meetings. So I just wanted to ask you if we think 2 hours is a better time frame to handle the several different topics. I don't know that we're going to have a major presentation like we had with Nate. So maybe 90 minutes, we could squeeze in 3 different presentations, but that's essentially what we're going to be dealing with, I think, so do we keep people engaged. Go ahead, Marta.
I can start earlier on, depending upon the day, I can be ready by 2:30, 2:45. So if that helps people, I'm teaching from home, so I don't have much of a commute.
I see.
And I'm teaching in school, but my school day ends at 2:10. So last time I just did the meeting from school. Today I managed to get home in time. But if we bump it up, I'll just do the meeting from my classroom instead of coming home. So I'm okay with bumping it up as long, 2:30 works for me too, if we want to bump it up by an hour.
Yeah, I appreciate the accommodation though.
Yeah, very much so.
Brian, what's best for you?
It's all bad for me. So I'm kidding, but yeah, I'm flexible. So earlier is fine as long as I have notice. I get commitments on the other end. Like I've got to get ready. I've got a school board meeting that's going to start in about an hour. So that's where I get trapped on this side of things. So if it's the will of the commission to start a little earlier, I can certainly do that as long as I have ample sufficient notice.
Good. So I think we should start at 3 then next time. Try that and see if. So that would be on the 16th. Anything else that folks feel they'd like to bring forward at this time?
I think good work. I think we're starting to see kind of the clarity of what our products and our outcomes are going to be, and it's nice to see from sort of the inception and the vision of things to start to become tangible. So I think good work to all.
You know, and I think we're starting to get the sense everybody here has a role and a contribution to make. And we've got to keep each other engaged in that process, whether it's on the launch or the implementation. I think just an acknowledgement, it's a talented group. If we don't make good use of this, of everybody's voices, that's why the start time and end time, I think, are important to make sure we're as inclusive as we can be. We need to do a roll call on a motion to adjourn. So I take that motion now.
So moved.
Thank you, Brian.
Second.
Thank you. Seconded by Robert. And I'll just read across the screen. Dina, yes?
Yes.
Jay, yes. Brian?
Yes.
Marna?
Yes.
Reverend Zach?
Yes.
Robert?
Yes.
Bishop?
Yes.
Ashley?
Yes.
Art? Take that as a yes. Thank you. Okay, thank you. And Alan, thank you for your great support and staying past the seat. I bet you're the last person on.
This was recorded as well, right, Alan?
This is the best part of my day, guys.
Well, we wish you well tomorrow.
Was this also recorded?
Yes, yes.
It's on your screen.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Yeah.
Bye, guys.
Thank
All
you.
right, thank you all. Happy holiday, and thanks for your good work.
Thank you.
Great.